The Old Fashioned is one of the most famous cocktails on earth, which makes it strangely good at starting arguments. And not just debates about taste or preference, but arguments about what belongs and what doesn't, what ruined it or how it was saved, what makes an Old Fashioned a real one, and what makes the others feel like deviations. And the strange part is that the drink itself is fairly simple: whiskey, sugar, bitters, and water, which is not a lot of moving parts for something with this much emotional baggage. I'm Spin, and this is Useful Rabbit Holes. And today I want to talk about the old-fashioned cocktail and how it became something greater than the sum of its parts. How over 2 centuries, this ordinary drink order became one of the most ubiquitous and contested drinks in cocktail history. Now, this isn't really going to be a recipe video. I'm not here to tell you the one correct way to make an old-fashioned or how you should enjoy yours. I'm more interested in the story of how people take relatively mundane things and, over time, inject them with meaning and culture until they become something deeply defended, even when the origins of that attachment have gone a little blurry. If stories like this sound like your kind of thing, subscribe now. There's more of this coming. For now, though, let's dig in. The Old Fashioned is interesting because it's no longer just one drink. Spend any time on cocktail YouTube and you'll find every version of Old Fashioned you could imagine. At this point, it's practically a whole category of drinks that follow a similar but ever-evolving standard. But dig into the comments and you'll see people get defensive about what a real Old Fashioned is. It has to follow some specific rule set. And if we look a little closer, you realize that they're not just defending a recipe. They're defending a memory or a region, a standard or a sense of seriousness. They're defending the drink that taught them what an old-fashioned was. But if we travel back to the early 1800s, there wasn't a drink called an old-fashioned at all. It actually begins with the older meaning of the word cocktail, which was a descriptor for a simple recipe built around any spirit. It was shorthand for a drink made with 4 ingredients: spirit, sugar, bitters, and water. It was really more a structure, not a recipe. And that matters because at this point, the drink is not yet sacred. It is not yet historical in the modern sense. It isn't surrounded by the anxiety of preserving its own history. It's just a standard way to ask for some booze in a glass. Now that can be a little hard to feel now because the drink has spent so long being treated as iconic. But originally, its simplicity wouldn't have read as minimalist or purist. It would have just been normal. A base spirit, some sweetness to balance out the heat of the alcohol, bitters to give it a complexity of flavor, and water to tie it all together. And that original plainness is important because it created the conditions for everything that came later. When a drink starts its life as a stripped-down structure, every later generation can project its own values onto that simplicity. Purity, authenticity, discipline, restraint, seriousness. But all of that comes later. At the start, it's just a drink. Then, towards the latter half of the century, bartenders began riffing on that older template. Drinks become more elaborate and flashier. Cocktails become improved, incorporating newer and often more exotic ingredients like absinthe and various liqueurs and amaros. Garnishes become more practiced and tidy, and the cocktail became more of an experience than a standard. But against that backdrop, old-fashioned becomes a request for an earlier structure. It's not neutral, it's a reaction to the changing times. It's someone saying, no thank you, I don't want the new thing, make it the older way, the way that I'm used to. And once a thing gets named through that kind of resistance, it starts carrying a posture as well as a recipe. And that matters because later generations inherit both. They inherit the drink itself, of course, but they also inherit the idea that the drink is somehow the correct one, the cleaner one, or the more proper one. In other words, the old-fashioned becomes a little argument of its own, a subtle defiance in the face of change. But once the old-fashioned leaves the abstract world of the cocktail formula and enters the real world, it is almost guaranteed to change. Not because everyone suddenly forgot what it was, but because drinks adapt to the places and the people that keep them alive. That, to me, is the real turning point in the story. A whiskey cocktail makes one kind of sense inside an older cocktail vocabulary, but a drink served night after night in supper clubs and banquet rooms, neighborhood bars, and other social settings has to do more than just preserve the structure. It has to meet the room that it's in. And once that happens, the custom starts to outweigh the formula. The recipe stops being the whole story. The formula tells you how something is built, but the custom tells you how people actually use it. So those drinks drift because the worlds around them drift. They get adapted to local tastes, local ingredients, local habits, and local expectations of ritual and what a good drink is supposed to feel like. That's not always a clean process, but it is usually a meaningful one. But this is often where the story of the old-fashioned gets flattened. You see, it's very easy, especially from a modern revivalist point of view, to tell the story of drift as decline. The drink was once clean, then people messed it up, and now we have to fix it. David Wondrich more or less does this in the Oxford Companion to Spirits and Cocktails. He describes the drink as becoming an over-diluted mess that is over-sweetened and made flaccid by the addition of fruit before being thankfully restored in the 1990s to something closer to its former glory. And while I can understand that point of view, especially from the perspective of the older cocktail formula, I think it gives too little credit to the decades when people were actually drinking, ordering, serving, and inheriting those versions. I'd rather treat the drift as part of the story, not just damage to be repaired, because that version of the story is too simple. It treats every change as noise instead of asking what problems those changes solved. In the 1920s and 30s, the cocktail world got turned on its head. Prohibition made ingredients scarcer, quality less reliable, and drinking culture much more improvisational. People used what they could get, what they could afford, and what they could make palatable. In that environment, sweeter spirits, fruit, sugar, and heavier-handed mixing make a lot more sense than they do in a world of carefully sourced whiskey and deliberate bar technique. Added sweetness and fruit help solve a very practical problem. A lot of alcohol people were getting was rough, inconsistent, or simply unpleasant. And once those habits take hold, they don't necessarily disappear when Prohibition does. Instead, they help shape the local form of the drink. With enough time behind them, they begin to feel less like improvisations and more like a tradition. After a while, once enough bars make those choices and enough people encounter the drink in that form, those additions really stop feeling like additions. Instead of being a variation of the drink of the past, it becomes the drink, not some technical object carefully compared to its predecessor, but a recognizable symbol of the time and place that kept it alive. And once a version of a drink gets embedded in restaurants, family gatherings, and local expectations, it no longer needs to justify itself historically. It spreads through repetition. People order what they know, bars serve what people expect, and the tradition keeps teaching itself. The 40s and 50s then see it become even more clearly a social drink as drinking culture moves back into homes, restaurants, and neighborhood bars. The garnishes get more elaborate as it becomes more of a show of hospitality and ceremony. The further it drifts from its earlier cousin, the stronger this new identity becomes. Which is why people from that tradition can hear modern cocktail people dismiss it and feel, quite reasonably, that what's being dismissed is not just a garnish choice, but an entire regional way of understanding what a drink is supposed to be. When the modern cocktail revival arrives, it reads all of this accumulated drift as a new problem to be solved. Revival culture is built around rediscovery. Old books, old techniques, and old drinks being taken seriously again after long periods of simplification, excess, or neglect. And the old-fashioned is almost a perfect restoration project. It's old, it's famous, structurally simple, it's very easy to over-embellish, and therefore extremely satisfying to fix. So the revival strips it back down, fruit gets removed or minimized, sweetness gets disciplined, garnish becomes restrained, we introduce modern ingredients with higher standards and better quality control, and the drink is made to read again as structure rather than ceremony. And to be clear, a lot of good comes out of that instinct. The revival restores proportion, seriousness, and attention to detail. It reminds people that the old-fashioned was a sharply defined drink, not just some loose template for whatever happened to be near the garnish tray. But every restoration carries the values of the people doing the restoring. Restoration is never just a neutral trip back in time, it's an interpretation of what should be brought forward, what should be cleared away, what counts as damage, and what counts as part of the object's life. Even when the work is careful and sincere, it still reflects a modern eye making decisions about the past. So the modern old-fashioned reflects a different set of values than its predecessor. Precision, clarity, structure, seriousness, proportion. The drink is no longer trying to be generous or festive. It's trying to be legible to people who care about correctness. And again, I don't mean this as an insult. A lot of very good drinks come from exactly that instinct, but it does mean that the old-fashioned is not some neutral final form. It's just another historical moment in the drink's life, shaped by the values of the people rebuilding it. And it's not even necessarily truer to the earliest drink in some complete sense, because so much of modern cocktail practice is its own aesthetic. Cleaner ice, tighter dilution ratios, more standardized techniques, more polished presentation, and a confidence that the drink should be read clearly and elegantly in the glass. That may produce the version that I happen to prefer, but preference and authenticity are not the same thing. So by this point, the old-fashioned is no longer one stable object. It is, at the very least, 3 overlapping lineages, each one carrying a different idea of what the drink is for. The early whiskey cocktail logic values structure, the Midwest supper club logic values familiarity, generosity, and local tradition, and the modern revival logic values restoration, clarity, and seriousness. And from inside each of those worlds, the preferred version doesn't feel like an arbitrary preference. It feels like the version that makes sense, the version that respects the history of the drink, the only version that understands what the drink is actually supposed to be. That's why people get defensive, because they're not just defending whiskey, sugar, bitters, and water, they're defending values, history, memory, discipline, region, familiarity, taste, and ceremony. And once those values get attached to a drink, disagreements about ingredients stop being small disagreements. The question is no longer just what goes in it. The question becomes, what is this thing, really? And once you're asking that, you're debating the drink's identity more than the recipe itself. Now, my own preference lives mostly in the modern cocktail world. I like the cleaner shape of the drink there, I like the stronger sense of structure, and I like that the drink usually tastes like it knows what it's trying to be. But I also don't think that makes the other versions fake or incorrect. It just means that I'm standing in one part of the family tree. And honestly, that's part of what makes the old-fashioned worth talking about. It's a small object with an unusually visible history. You can still see the different eras sitting in the glass. You can still see where one generation dressed it up, and another stripped it back down, and another decided what mattered most was not history exactly, but what kind of experience the drink created in the room. And when someone serves you one, you can sometimes see a small part of the era or region that was passed down to them. If you're curious, I put my usual spec in the description below, and I'd actually be interested to hear what version you grew up with or what version feels most correct to you. So I don't think the old-fashioned has a recipe problem so much as an identity problem, or maybe an identity surplus. It became old enough, familiar enough, and famous enough to collect multiple ideas of itself, and now people keep mistaking those ideas for truth. But that's what happens to things people care about. People turn them into stories, and the argument is more about which part of the story you think deserves to survive. And maybe that's why the old-fashioned lasts. It's simple enough to carry all of those meanings without breaking, and famous enough that people keep finding themselves somewhere inside its history. So the argument never really ends, because every time the drink is made, it's being remembered, reinterpreted, and claimed over and over again. Thanks for watching, and thanks for taking this little trip with me. If stories like this sound like your kind of thing, there's more of this coming. Stories, experiments, and the occasional look at how I do things and why in whatever corner of the world seems worth paying attention to next. Like and subscribe if you want to follow me down more rabbit holes, and I'll see you in the next one.